Hawaii hasn't taken a direct hurricane hit since 1992. That's 34 years. And right now, a storm currently just called Potential Tropical Cyclone One-C is on a track that has forecasters using words like rare and landfall in the same sentence for the first time in a generation. Here's the number I want you watching by the end of this video, and it's not the wind speed. It's a rainfall total, because that specific figure is what emergency officials are actually most worried about, more than the storms category. If tracking real storm science and the actual forecasting behind it interests you, subscribing costs nothing, and it means you'll be here as this storm actually arrives. Let's start with exactly what's out there right now, because the storm doesn't even have its final name yet, and that detail matters more than you'd think. As of Wednesday, the National Hurricane Center began issuing advisories on a system it's calling Potential Tropical Cyclone One-C, located roughly 900 miles east-southeast of Hawaii's Big Island. Maximum sustained winds sat at 40 miles an hour, moving west at about 9 miles an hour. Forecasters put the odds of it becoming a fully organized tropical storm within 48 hours at 90%. Here's why it doesn't have a name yet. The rotation at the center of the system isn't fully closed off. Once it does close into a proper circulation, it becomes eligible for the next name on the Central Pacific's list, Lala. That's expected to happen sometime Wednesday night or early Thursday. Here's the actual forecast track, because this is genuinely one of the more direct paths toward the islands we've seen in years. By Thursday evening, winds are forecast near 45 miles an hour. By Friday evening, as it approaches the Big Island directly, 60 miles an hour. By Saturday evening, 70 miles an hour, just 4 miles an hour short of hurricane strength. By Sunday evening, still 65 miles an hour as it passes south of Oahu and Kauai. By Monday evening, 70 miles an hour again as it finally moves west, away from the island chain. Here's the number I promised you. The Central Pacific Hurricane Center's forecast calls for rainfall totals of 5 to 10 inches across much of the island chain, with maximum totals up to 20 inches possible in the wettest spots. That's the figure driving nearly every official warning issued so far, not the wind speed. Here's exactly why officials are more worried about the rain than the wind. Hawaii's terrain is genuinely mountainous, and when moisture-laden air gets forced upward against those slopes, it wrings out rain far more efficiently than flat terrain ever would. The National Weather Service in Honolulu has specifically flagged the Big Island and Maui County as the areas of greatest concern. Drop a comment and tell me if you're in Hawaii right now, or if you've got a trip planned there this weekend. I read these, and I genuinely want to know how this is actually playing out on the ground as it happens. If you want to be the first to know every time this storm's forecast shifts, subscribe to the channel right now. It's completely free. A thumbs up also helps enormously. Let's go for 5,000 likes on this one so the algorithm shows it to the people who need to see it. Here's the part of this story that genuinely stopped me while researching it. The last hurricane to make direct landfall in Hawaii was Iniki back in 1992. It hit Kauai as a Category 4, with sustained winds around 145 miles an hour. It remains, to this day, the costliest hurricane in Hawaiian history. That's not ancient history. That's 34 years without a single direct hit, in a state where most residents under 40 have never personally lived through one. It's worth being precise about terminology here because landfall and near Hawaii mean genuinely different things. The official National Hurricane Center track has the storm's center passing directly over or very close to the Big Island Friday into Saturday, then tracking just south of Oahu and Kauai through the weekend. Whether that technically counts as a full landfall or a close pass depends. Forecasters have been explicit that confidence in the exact track is still increasing, not yet locked in. It's worth putting Iniki's 1992 devastation into real, concrete terms because costliest hurricane in Hawaiian history can sound abstract. Iniki caused billions of dollars in damage across Kauai specifically, destroying thousands of homes and severely damaging thousands more, and knocked out power across the entire island for an extended period, in some rural areas for months rather than days. The storm's 145-mile-an-hour winds stripped roofs from buildings never engineered to withstand anything close to that intensity, since a direct hurricane hit on Hawaii was, at that point, itself a genuinely rare event. That's the actual scale officials are implicitly referencing every time they use the word landfall in connection with this week's system, even though nobody is forecasting anything close to that same intensity from the storm currently approaching. Let's talk about exactly which islands face the highest risk from this specific track, because Hawaii actually covers 8 major islands spread across hundreds of miles of ocean, and this storm's impact won't be uniform across all of them. The Big Island sits most directly in the storm's path as it approaches Friday, meaning it's likely to experience the earliest and most direct impacts, both from wind and from the heavy rainfall interacting with Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa. Maui and Oahu, farther along the storm's forecast track, are more likely to experience impacts as a close pass rather than a direct hit, though the current forecast cone still includes real possibility of significant rainfall and gusty winds there too. Kauai, the island Iniki struck directly in 1992, sits toward the tail end of this system's forecast path, meaning residents there currently have the most lead time to watch how the storm's behavior plays out before it's their turn. Let's talk about how a storm actually gets its name, because potential tropical cyclone is a specific, deliberate label, not just jargon. The National Hurricane Center created that designation to issue warnings before a system technically meets the criteria for a named storm, when its impacts are expected to arrive soon enough that waiting for full classification would cost people real preparation time. Officials aren't waiting for the storm's circulation to fully close off before telling Hawaii residents to get ready. Here's exactly what getting ready means. Honolulu city officials have been urging residents to prepare now, and crews have been actively working to clear debris from streams like Manoa Stream, specifically to reduce flash flood risk. Clogged urban streams are one of the most common causes of flash flooding during heavy tropical rain events, and clearing them in advance changes how much water ends up in streets and homes instead of channels. Let's talk about the mechanism behind that rainfall threat, because understanding it explains why forecasters keep repeating the same warning. This storm is moving over unusually warm water, and warm ocean water is the fuel that pulls moisture upward into its circulation. When that moisture-loaded system then runs into Hawaii's volcanic terrain, mountains rising directly from sea level to over 13,000 feet, the air gets forced rapidly upward, cooling as it rises, and wringing out rain at rates flat terrain simply doesn't produce. That's why a storm that never quite reaches hurricane strength can still produce genuinely historic flooding. Hawaii holds several U.S. rainfall records tied to tropical moisture, including some of the highest 24-hour rainfall totals ever recorded. A storm producing 20 inches in isolated spots would sit within range of those historic events, even without a hurricane classification. 6 inches of fast-moving water is enough to knock an adult off their feet. 12 inches can carry away a small car. In steep terrain, rainfall concentrates rapidly into narrow valleys, turning a dry gulch into a dangerous wall of water within minutes. That's exactly why officials specifically warned about mudslides and flooding in areas of steep terrain. As the storm's center passes through the island chain, forecasters expect dangerous surf and coastal flooding on shores facing the storm. That's a genuinely separate warning from the flash flood risk inland, since a coastal resident safely above any stream valley can still face real danger from storm surge and large waves at the shoreline itself. Here's something worth understanding about widespread power outages, since officials have specifically flagged them as an expected impact, even before the storm's exact strength is confirmed. Hawaii's electrical grid, especially on the outer islands, relies heavily on above-ground power lines, running through exactly the kind of dense vegetation that sustained tropical storm force winds, even well below hurricane strength, can bring down across roads and lines simultaneously. Combined with heavy rain making repair crew access more difficult, that's precisely why widespread multi-day outages are a realistic expectation here, independent of whether the storm ever technically reaches hurricane classification. It's worth explaining exactly what happens to a tropical system once it actually starts interacting with Hawaii's terrain. Because the mountains don't just add rainfall, they can genuinely disrupt the storm's own structure too. As a tropical cyclone's low-level circulation encounters the Big Island's massive volcanic peaks, Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa both rising well over 13,000 feet. The terrain can physically interfere with the storm's core, sometimes weakening the system's peak winds even as it dumps enormous amounts of rain on the windward slopes. That's part of why forecasters are watching this system's exact track so closely. A path that takes the center directly over the Big Island's tallest peaks could produce a meaningfully different outcome than a path that stays just offshore, even if the difference in position is only a few dozen miles. Let's talk about what makes this year's broader Pacific hurricane season notable, because this storm isn't happening in a climatological vacuum. Sea surface temperatures across large stretches of the central and eastern Pacific have been running above their historical averages this summer. And warmer ocean water doesn't just fuel individual storms once they form, it also tends to support more storms forming. In the first place, since tropical cyclogenesis depends heavily on ocean heat content in the upper layers of water a developing system draws from. Meteorologists tracking this season have noted activity running above typical levels for this point in the year across the broader Pacific basin. Part of the same pattern that's now produced both Hernan in the eastern Pacific and the system approaching Hawaii within roughly 24 hours. It's worth understanding exactly how forecasters translate raw wind speed into the specific hazard categories residents actually hear about. Tropical storm warnings versus hurricane warnings versus flash flood watches, because each one triggers different official guidance. A tropical storm warning means sustained winds of 39 to 73 miles an hour are expected within 36 hours. A hurricane warning means sustained winds of 74 miles an hour or higher are expected in that same window. Flash flood watches and warnings operate on an entirely separate rainfall-based system issued by local weather forecast offices based on how much rain has already fallen and how much more is expected, independent of the storm's wind classification entirely. That's exactly why a system could theoretically remain a tropical storm by wind speed standards, while simultaneously triggering the most severe flash flood warnings. The National Weather Service issues precisely the scenario Hawaii's terrain makes genuinely plausible here. Let's talk about how residents can actually monitor this storm's progress in real time over the coming days. Because relying solely on periodic news updates can mean missing genuinely important shifts in the forecast. The Central Pacific Hurricane Center publishes full advisories every 6 hours during an active system like this one, each one including an updated forecast track, wind speed probabilities, and a detailed discussion explaining exactly why forecasters adjusted the track, or intensity from the previous update, if they did. That discussion section, often overlooked in favor of just the colored map graphic, is genuinely where the most useful information lives, explaining the specific atmospheric factors forecasters are weighing, as they refine exactly how confident they are in each piece of the forecast. Let's zoom out, because this storm isn't developing in isolation, and understanding the broader Pacific picture right now actually tells you something important about why this particular season has been active. Hundreds of miles to the east, Tropical Storm Hernan formed in the eastern Pacific early Thursday morning west of southern Baja, California. Forecasters expect Hernan to turn southwest and weaken without affecting land, a completely separate system from what's heading toward Hawaii. It's worth mentioning specifically because two named systems active in the Pacific Basin at the same time isn't unusual for this point in the season, but it does mean forecasters at both centers are tracking multiple systems simultaneously this week. Let's talk about how the storm naming list actually works, because Lala isn't a random choice. It's the next name in a predetermined rotation. The Central Pacific Basin, the region specifically covering Hawaii, maintains its own separate list of storm names, distinct from the Eastern Pacific list. Names get used in alphabetical order as storms form each season, and the list rotates on a multi-year cycle. Lala has appeared on this list before and will appear again, unless a storm becomes destructive enough that organizations vote to retire it permanently. This is the same process that retired the name Iniki after 1992. Here's a practical detail if you have travel plans this weekend. Airlines serving Hawaii typically issue travel waivers ahead of a forecast storm, allowing passengers to rebook flights without normal change fees. Checking your airline's website directly for an active weather waiver is genuinely one of the most useful things you can do right now. Hawaii's own emergency management system actually does things differently than mainland states because the state's geography creates unique challenges. Unlike a mainland hurricane where residents can evacuate by car, Hawaii's islands offer no equivalent option. The guidance centers on sheltering in place, securing property, and stocking supplies rather than the highway evacuations mainland residents might know. Officials recommend having at least 14 days of food, water, and medication on hand, given the state's isolation from mainland supply chains. Secure or bring inside any loose outdoor items capable of becoming projectiles in high wind. Know your specific flood zone status, since flash flood risk varies dramatically even between neighborhoods just a few miles apart. And charge phones, batteries, and any backup power equipment now before outages potentially begin. It's worth being honest about the genuine uncertainty in this forecast. Forecasters have been explicit. Confidence is increasing for impacts this weekend. Exactly how strong the storm becomes and precisely where its center tracks remain uncertain and will likely shift right until it arrives. The Central Pacific Hurricane Center relies heavily on geostationary satellite imagery, providing updated views of the storm's cloud structure. They also use scatterometer data from polar orbiting satellites to estimate surface wind speeds by measuring how wind roughens the sea surface. Hurricane Hunter aircraft reconnaissance flights are far less frequently dispatched for Central Pacific systems given the enormous distances involved. Tourism represents an enormous share of Hawaii's economy, and the islands host tens of thousands of visitors unfamiliar with tropical storms. Hotels activate emergency protocols early, briefing guests on shelter locations and coordinating with county emergency management. Many people affected may have never experienced a tropical system and may not know the difference between a warning and a mandatory evacuation order. It's worth explaining the actual difference between a hurricane watch and a hurricane warning, since both terms will likely appear in official communications. Over the next 48 hours, these terms mean genuinely different things for everyone in the region. A hurricane watch means hurricane conditions are possible within the watch area, typically issued when there's a real but not yet certain chance. This usually applies when hurricane-force winds are expected to arrive within roughly 48 hours. A hurricane warning is more urgent, issued when hurricane conditions are expected within 36 hours. This means preparations should already be complete, not just underway, as conditions will deteriorate quickly. As of this recording, Hawaii sits in the watch phase of this system, meaning the situation could still escalate to warnings. Alternatively, the storm could weaken enough that warnings never become necessary at all, depending on the next few forecast updates. It's worth understanding why this year's Central Pacific season has produced this kind of direct threat, when so many previous seasons haven't. Storm tracks across this basin are heavily influenced by the position and strength of the subtropical ridge. This persistent area of high pressure normally sits north of the islands and tends to steer approaching systems toward the south. This steering pattern is responsible for Hawaii's 34-year stretch without a direct hit from a major storm. When that ridge weakens or shifts position, it can open a more direct path for a storm to track closer to the island chain. Exactly that kind of temporary shift in the ridge's position is what forecasters have been watching develop over the past several days. It's a meaningfully different setup than what steered previous close call systems safely south of the islands in recent years. I want to be direct about something here, because it would be easy to let this story spiral into something it isn't. Nobody's forecasting anything close to Iniki's Category 4 intensity from this current system. The current forecast tops out around 70 miles an hour, potentially brushing Category 1 strength at 74. That's a fundamentally different storm than the one that struck Kauai in 1992. What makes this genuinely newsworthy isn't catastrophic wind potential. It's the rarity of the direct approach. It is also about a rainfall threat that doesn't actually require hurricane-strength winds to become dangerous. So here's the honest, complete picture of what's actually approaching Hawaii this weekend. A system currently still technically unnamed, with a 90% chance of becoming Tropical Storm Lala within 48 hours. It is tracking almost directly toward the Big Island, with winds forecast to peak right at the hurricane threshold Saturday. After that, it is expected to pass south of the rest of the island chain through the weekend. The real threat isn't primarily wind. It's up to 20 inches of rain falling on mountainous terrain. This terrain is specifically built to turn that rain into dangerous flash flooding within minutes. Stay informed and complete your flood preparations as the system makes its final approach.